Welcome to It's Bloody Complicated, the Compass podcast. I'm Neil Lawson, your host and director of Compass. Joining me to help manage the questions in a bit is Grace Barnett from the Compass office. Hello, Grace. Are you okay?
Hello, yeah, I'm okay.
These are our unprecedented times and we need to rise to the new and enormous challenges we now face. Over the next few weeks, we'll be speaking with writers, thinkers, politicians, journalists and public service workers about how we come out of all of this in much better shape than we went into it. A good society after COVID-19, indeed. These conversations have live access for Compass members who put their own questions directly to our guests. If you want to participate in a future live call, go to compassonline.org.uk/podcast to join Compass. Otherwise, just sit back, relax and enjoy this week's podcast. The virus impacts on everyone, but it impacts on them differently. Joining us this week to discuss the crisis is the designer, thinker, writer, author and social entrepreneur, Hilary Cottam. As you can tell, Hilary has a super interesting career and we'll ask her more about that in a minute. How does a public service and social innovator become UK Designer of the Year? Her most recent book, Radical Help, was described by Jonathan Freedland of The Guardian as a publication that would transform Britain. The format for the conversation is that I'll ask Hilary a few questions and then open it up to Compass members on the call for questions and comments before we finish within 60 minutes. So, draws breath. Hilary, thanks so much for being on the call tonight. It's great to have you. Just tell people roughly where you are, not your exact location, unless they can't get you. And how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Neil, and thank you for inviting me. As a long-time Compass member, I'm very delighted to be with you this evening. I'm in Peckham, where I live and work. I normally work from a studio in the car park here in Peckham, but right now I'm in my house. For those watching on Zoom, you can't see the kind of, the chaos from my studio is up to about my kind of waist level, but fortunately you can't see it on the Zoom screen.
So as I was in the introduction, you've had let's say an interesting career, and I think when we get into some of the ideas and your thinking and your practice, I think it'd be really helpful for people to understand how you got from where you were to here and the different things you've done, the very different things you've done. So do you want to kind of walk people through that about what you've done and why you've done, and then we can begin to understand a bit more about who you are and what you are?
Well, I suppose there's two halves to my career. I mean, one half was working internationally, and then in the second half, I've been working here in the UK. And I think really the path is one of tactics, really, of trying to think all the time, like, how can we make change? What ways of working, what kind of institutional form will really make change happen? Obviously, I'm still idealistic, but I started off very idealistic. I joined the humanitarian wing of a guerrilla army in northern Ethiopia. I went from there to work for a very large international charity, Care International, and from there to the World Bank, where I had a brief working on urban poverty in Southern Africa. And what really struck me in all those three experiences was the difficulty of connecting the sort of resource, the ideas of people who meant well, to the real world and making change happen. And I saw kind of again and again how things that looked really logical in one context inside the institution really didn't work or look logical when they met real life, and often had quite negative, unexpected consequences. So that set me off a path really about thinking. I mean, I suppose half my life is methodological, like what ways can we work that really enable us to listen, to get into the shoes of others, to connect people and relationships in different ways. And that's something that I'm still evolving and continue to evolve. And a lot of that is working visually, which links to the design part that you mentioned. And then in the second part of my career, I've been kind of basically focused here in the UK. I mean, obviously I'm a child of Thatcher. One of the reasons that I left was because in the late 80s, it wasn't possible to think of making any social change here in the UK. By the late 90s, I thought it was possible. And so I kind of wanted to come back to my own country and work here. And I'm still very much rooted here. Oh, so I haven't covered the kind of path that's here, have I? That's the bit that sort of... so the work here in the UK really has been focused on the welfare state as a sort of route to kind of thinking about poverty and inequality. And over the last 10 years, through a social enterprise I started called Participal, what we did was we worked with communities across Britain to think about how we could grow new forms of welfare state that could support people cradle to grave. So I think the important idea running through my current work, which obviously links to the work of Compass, is that, you know, we had this extraordinary welfare revolution in this country in the post-45 era that John Harris was talking about last week. And that revolution responded to, you know, the crisis of war, the sort of leftover crisis of war, the recession of the 1930s, but also I think a technology revolution that had changed society, the means of production, and there needed to be a different way to join society and the economy back together in a way that everybody could flourish. And I think that set of systems, that revolution has run its course, and that we need to really think again about what we need to flourish in this century, which again links so much to the work that Compass does on the good society. And I think that it's a mistake to put any more resource into these 1950s systems, which in any way have been sort of cannibalized and hollowed out through a sort of process of reform and marketization. And that actually we need to go back to the founding questions of the welfare state and that revolutionary spirit and ask again what we need to do in this century, which I think is very different, in order to thrive.
And there's loads of stuff in that, and we'll try and unpack as much of it as we can. But I'm intrigued by the fact that you were at the design. I think other people will be. You were at the Design Council, and that's an interesting place for a social policy innovator to be. Just talk people through that a bit.
Well, I mean, a story I can tell is that when I was at the World Bank, there was going to be this massive multi-million water investment. They were going to refurbish the water systems in Zambia. So I went out and I stayed in what they called the compounds, which are the sort of informal urban areas. Zambia is actually a very urbanized country for Africa. And of course, what I discovered was that nobody in the compounds, 70% of the population, have any access to the water supply. So I had to go back to Washington, DC and convince my colleagues, I'm proud to say I was successful, that putting the whole investment into the water infrastructure was a complete waste of time, because you'd get a better water infrastructure, but you'd still have 70% of people left out of any access to water. And whilst I was doing a PhD, actually, which is another, I won't go there because it'll get like a Ronnie Corbett story, but whilst I was doing the PhD, the Blair government said that they were going to refurbish secondary schools in Britain. And I thought that this was a precise analogy to the Zambian water idea, which is, why on earth would you refurbish 1950s infrastructure when you're coming up to the 21st century? Why would you not use that money to think about what learning should be like in the 21st century, and then think about what environments would be needed for learning? So well, in fact, it was a bit like now. I was sort of stuck in my bedroom, and I sent a pamphlet to every secondary school in Britain asking this question. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any connections, so I didn't know how to get started. And I got a response, and I started a project in a school in South London. And Estelle Morris supported me, actually, and we raised 14 million. She was then the Secretary of State for Education, and we basically redesigned the pastoral care system, the curriculum, and the school building. I didn't do the school building, architects did, and it won awards. And the school, and then 65 more that became part of this program, became very successful. So I was then invited to the Design Council to think much more broadly about public service reform. And I was very interested. I was interested for two reasons. One is that at the World Bank, I sat in an infrastructure department, because actually that is where resource is. Most money that we could be using for social causes is locked up in sort of solid infrastructure where it shouldn't be. So if you can get your hands on that budget, you've got quite a lot of money to kind of make social change happen. But the other thing was that because I'd been working in this very visual way in Africa, in Latin America, I knew that I needed to change my methods. Like, you know, I've been working with sticks and stones and drawing stuff in the dirt. And I knew that if I started to do that in Peckham or in Govan, people would think I'm really crazy. And so I tried with architects to kind of develop visual methods, and it hadn't really worked. That's quite a long story. But I thought that designers with their kind of processes for product design and graphic design would be a much more interesting kind of combination and enable me to kind of move my methods on. And so it proved to be. I was able to build a really amazing team at the Design Council called the Red Team, and to really think up what then became known as social design with my colleagues, and to kind of do, I think, some work that I was proud of. It was small scale, but that I was proud of with communities across Britain.
Okay, I was going to start more with the crisis, but let's end with the crisis. So let's roll that on to where you've got to with Radical Help, which was the book that your most recent book, which, as Jonathan Frieden rightly said, I mean, it has had an impact. I've read it. Loads and loads of people I know have read it and have got an awful lot out of it. And my biggest take is that one of unleashing capacity. The recognition that there is so much in people, and with your design skills, how do we begin to create the conditions in which we bring all of that brilliance out of people? Just walk us through Radical Help a bit and how you got to that and where that's going next.
Well, I mean, before we sort of went live, we were talking about the 1945 moment, and originally I studied history, and I'm very interested in how that social revolution came about. And I think one of the critical things was that there was a public understanding of why change needed to happen, and a massive public support, and actually a big appetite for, when Beveridge travelled all across the country, people came to meet him and they were like, be radical, don't just sort of fix things. And I felt that what we're missing as part of, what needs to happen to make change. I mean, this kind of also relates to Compass's 45-degree change work. But what we were missing was a much bigger public debate about why we need to make change. And that debate is missing and hard to have in Britain, because such has been the sort of attack on the public sector and the retrenchment and now the cuts, that anybody who puts their head above the parapet and says that the 1950s institutions don't really work, there's a kind of danger that you might be seen as kind of arguing for no kind of welfare state at all. And so it's become kind of locked into a very sterile left-right market state debate. And I felt like that to give politicians any chance actually of moving this on, there needs to be a much bigger debate. So I thought it would be worthwhile to write a public-facing book. It's published by Little Brown. It's a sort of easy read, full of stories about how things are and why they need to change. And it's been amazing for me to have the kind of possibility to go to literature festivals, to talk to very big public audiences about the welfare state. And that's been a really open conversation. People are up for radical change. What I never anticipated actually was that, Neil, people like you would read it, or social workers or nurses. There's been a kind of, it's in its 6th edition. It's been translated into many languages. And I think I didn't see that hunger within the state itself and within the system for kind of thinking about this in this way.
And so take us through the kind of, which I think chimes a lot with the work that Compass has been doing around 45 degrees. I mean, you said before we went live that, which I think was a really smart insight, that in 1945, it almost didn't matter who the government was. The ideas and the moment crystallized to enable the beginnings of the new social welfare settlement. What do you see about the conditions now, the culture, the technology, which makes you think that they are aligned to the kind of outline that you do in Radical Help? What is it about the moment?
Well, one of the things, so Radical Help basically is a story then cradle to grave, starting with family life and ending with aging, about how we could reinvent the original dream of flourishing and what it would look like. Because one of the things that I think is really important is it wouldn't look like service delivery. I mean, Beveridge, he wasn't interested in services. He was interested in what are the components. I mean, of course, he studied ancient Greek, and he was all about, what are the components for a sort of Aristotelian flourishing. And it's not that I don't think we need services, but I think the kind of reflex action that we've got to design a service is the wrong one. So one of the things that I see now that I think is so exciting is, of course, overnight we've seen a flourishing of social infrastructure. We've seen people use digital infrastructure not as some sort of app to kind of, tape over a failing in the existing system, but to create something completely agile and connected and new, to take care of neighbours, to kind of make masks because we haven't got any PPE, whatever it is. I think that's a really exciting moment, not because I think that we can expect exactly those same things to carry on after the crisis, but we can see that energy, that imagination, the kind of willingness to participate. And if we just think about care, I mean, I think one of the reasons that we've been so blocked in kind of solving the care crisis is because there's this idea that we're going to create the sister of the NHS. We're going to have the National Care Service, which of course is an absurdity in the 21st century. What we're going to do is build something very light touch, localized, that kind of connects together in new ways to making sure that people don't fall through. That's something we could talk about, but something that is much closer to what we've seen happening on our streets and villages now than kind of the sort of centralized NHS, which I think it's very interesting. I mean, we're lionizing in this crisis, but actually what we can see in the NHS is that it just is completely not designed for this crisis. It's full of amazing people doing their best despite all the problems within the system.
So I mean, as well as being that kind of service designer, you're also quite a political person, hence your membership of an organisation like Compass. Have you thought through at all the intersection between the meeting point between that work and that sense of innovation and agility and everything that needs in terms of its culture, and the clunkiness of our political Westminster systems? I mean, you tend to keep away from that stuff, or are you keeping away from that stuff? You said you were speaking to Estelle Morris when she was working with her, but how are we going to flip the system? Are you thinking about that in order to move from the paradigm shift of the clunky bureaucratic to the agile, nimble, networked?
Oh, there's so much to say, Neil. It's hard to know where to start. I mean, because one of the things I should have said about the kind of current social infrastructure is that in the models I develop, people always believe they'll work in some other place. They think people won't participate where they live. And of course, we've seen that that's not true. So I think this is something you can come back to. I think there's 4 sectors of society that are needed to make change, and the kind of social change we're talking about. And perhaps the most critical and the most blocked is the state, and politics is needed. So there's a couple of things. One is that John Harris talked about this last week, which is that the kind of work and energy that I tap into at the community level is not political in a traditional sense. You know, you can't, if you want everybody to participate, you've got to kind of build work across parties, you've got to meet people where they're at. And I characterize the systems I build as very horizontal. But politics is still a kind of deeply vertical, hierarchical, stratified system. And so it connects very uncomfortably with the kind of, horizontal energies that I'm using. And yet at the same time, without politics, we can't see a way through. We can't create the kind of, Beveridge, if we think about Beveridge, his blueprint, he was like, this is how it's going to be. You can either behave according to this blueprint and you can be funded. We know, for instance, that doctors hated it and they came kicking and screaming into the NHS, or you won't be funded. I mean, can you imagine doing that today? It would take politicians to say, these are the new design principles, this is the way we're going, you'll only receive funding if we travel in this direction. So politics is needed. If you say that I'm not visible around Westminster, I mean, I can say that no member of the shadow front bench has ever asked to meet me to discuss radical health. I think they are perhaps the only political party in the world that haven't. I mean, parties of all colours from every single continent have asked to meet with me, but not the Labour Party. And I think also, I mean, Neil, this, is that it takes tremendous amounts of energy and resource to engage and to try and move the needle at all. And I suppose, it is just a question of resource, of actually how to engage and make change, compared to actually the possibilities that I have of actually building services and approaches that thousands of people can use that do actually change lives. But I'm happy to be invited in. I'm just waiting for the call, Neil. That's all.
Let's see who's on the call. I think we've got Steve Reed lined up for a later podcast. I think someone like Steve Reed, who's now Shadow Communities and local government, would be super interested. So we'll match.
Steve has always been a kind of huge champion of the work, but also I think there has been a slight nervousness you know, within the, if we're talking specific, I mean, both parties have got problems. The problem of the Labour Party is that they're afraid to kind of let people take control, and the problem of the Conservative Party is that they've got no analysis of the state. So you have this kind of ridiculousness of the big society, which, you know, I mean, I don't want to just kind of write it off in that way, but because time is short and I don't want to spend the precious time talking about big society. But I think there was a kind of feeling for a while amongst people who did understand this, let's say like Steve, is that the state should just step back. Whereas actually, of course, what the state needs to do is kind of rethink its role so that it can actually step actively forward.
But that's a different culture and a different nature to the state, isn't it? It is neither stepping back nor is it doing things for people. It's doing things to help people help themselves.
But I had a very kind of, you know, visceral experience of this canvassing in the last election, you know, for marginal Labour candidates, and talking about the same things that I might go into a community to talk about as me, Hilary Cottam, become really difficult and complicated to talk about within that kind of party construct. And obviously, I mean, that's why Compass is interesting, because it's recognising that and grappling with that, you know, how to kind of broaden, but then how to also make change within what is still a two-party system.
Well, let's hope we can do something about breaking that out to more than just two parties. And I don't know how many members of the Shadow Cabinet on the call, but if they are, or if there's anybody else, do start loading up any questions in the chat thing, because I'll ask a few more and then we'll flip over to you. So get your questions in as soon as possible to make your points about public service reform, the mutual aid stuff, etc., etc. I read recently a document you posted on your website, Hilary, called Social Revolution 5.0, and that all felt very in the same vein, or in a better vein than the Compass work. Do you want to tell us a bit about that? And maybe Grace or Jack, whoever's on the call, could put the link from your site and that onto the chat thing, so people can read that for themselves. Tell us a bit about Social Revolution 5.0.
Well, that'd be great. I'd love people to read that. And then my email is also on my website, so people can send me comments. That's a kind of work in progress. So that would be brilliant. So I think that the 5.0 responds to a few things. So first of all, Radical Help is a very British-centric book. I never imagined when I wrote it that there would be this big international interest in it, but there is. And so I wanted to kind of think about something in that context. I also think that there's a couple of, well, one thing where I would want to extend Radical Help, and one thing which I think is missing. So because Radical Help is really a story about the work I was doing in communities, you know, on the sort of social change side, it doesn't really address the sort of ecological disaster that is coming down the tracks. And it doesn't, you know, it's a book about relationships, but it isn't about our relationship with nature, although in the kind of capability framework I use, that, you know, capability to connect in that way is part of it. So I also wanted to kind of position my work within that crisis, because I think we can't see these things as separate, the social challenges from the ecological challenges, from the economic and the political, and that framework needs to come together. So I wanted to kind of extend the work in that way, and then kind of draw out some kind of design principles which I thought might be interesting. I mean, the other thing that is a sort of extension of Radical Help, which is just, when I was kind of running and building and working 24/7 with no time to reflect before I wrote the book, I hadn't really thought about this sort of very obvious but huge problem, which is the number of families in work receiving credits of whatever form. And I think that, you know, this is a system completely out of kilter, and that we can't any longer kind of talk about social reform without thinking about new forms of economics, and in particular thinking really radically about work, how it's paid, how it's organised, its intersection with care. And that in a way those problems have been pushed onto the welfare state, and it's a category error. They need to be kind of recategorised and rethought, which is where my current work is going. So you might remember, Neil, that before the work I did redesigning the welfare state, I published a manifesto called Beveridge 4.0. And so I guess Revolution 5.0 is sort of moving forward in a way. I also I'm always thinking about technology revolutions and how this work fits with that. And so 5.0 also, connects to Carlota Perez's work on the fifth technology revolution and what that means for kind of the symbiotic need for kind of social revolution.
Yes, and so let's finally get on to the current kind of crisis, one of many crises. Observing it out of my window and through my Zoom screen, you've got both the clunky state has reasserted itself, and thank heavens it has in some instances, but then you've also, as you've inferred, you've got this kind of beautiful, agile, fluid, responsive mutual aid thing. They don't seem to be talking to each other very much, do they? And in one member of parliament who was talking to me about being on a call with his local mutual aid thing, said that they didn't want the state to jump on them, but they knew that they needed some help and some nurturing and some support. And he was sitting there thinking, now this is 45 degrees. What do you think about this moment and the crisis and what it's revealing and what it tells us and you about your work?
Well, I think it's a big moment. I think definitely, of course, what I'm personally hoping is there's no back to normal. When I read the FT calling in its sort of op-ed section for kind of, a huge investment in a new social settlement, I'm kind of elated and also terrified, because I think that probably does mean just kind of pouring money into redundant 1950s systems, because I don't see kind of enough energy around the new, although hopefully this kind of conversation is part of building that. I think there's also a kind of conceptual disconnection. It's not just a disconnection between the actual practical help you're talking about, kind of with what's promised by kind of, let's say, Rishi Sunak stepping up, as well as kind of the sort of mutual aid. There's also a sort of conceptual disconnection. I mean, I think this is a moment for really clear principles around the financial aid that begin to set ratios of pay, that begin to kind of acknowledge, as the conversation is starting, is who is paying tax where, that begin to kind of set the kind of conditions for a green transition. Like, if you're kind of not in a green industry, what does that mean and how do you receive that? And then, of course, that connects intimately to the social settlement of what kind of social settlement do we need then for that kind of bigger transition we've got to make, which means all different forms of support, from kind of high value continued learning to care to very radically rethought forms of work organisation, which might be kind of modernised trades unions, might be something completely different, and so on. But I think the thing to say is that work is there. I mean, but if we think about Beveridge, he from the 1930s started to prototype the welfare state models in the East End. He built the job centres, he ran them, he tried them. And actually what's happened now is that has happened. There's my work in radical health, there's flat pack democracy in Frome, there's what's happening in Plymouth, in East Ayrshire, in Barrow. But of course, rightly, it's highly decentralised at the moment. It isn't kind of, Beveridge and Keynes and their mates at the LSE kind of running the experiments, because if it was, that wouldn't work now in the modern world. But then the challenge is how we bring those principles together and begin to channel the flow of investment towards that reality, that marginal but future reality, versus the kind of core, which we've seen fail. I mean, it's not just a centralised NHS, it's, right in the beginning, cycling past supermarkets with endless queues and into my local shops that were well stocked and ready to go, because localised, distributed infrastructure, whether it's food or health, is working really well, and the centre is not.
Good. Okay. Dawning of the end of the century of the centre. The opening of the century of the diverse and the local. Grace, do you want to start picking out a few questions that have appeared in the chat thing so far, and introduce a few more people into the conversation?
Yeah, sure. Why not? I think we'll start with Jonathan, just because he was the first.
You were talking a lot about Beveridge. I work for Citizens Advice as a volunteer, and we get a lot of people coming through with issues, particularly at the moment, about universal credit and how that positions people. And it sort of strikes me the way there has been a massive reform in the welfare state, but it's come from the right. It's come from the reform of benefits, so that people are positioned as sort of being not quite citizens in the new system. And that seems to be the benchmark that people have to move away from.
Well, what I would say actually is that universal credit is not a reform. And in fact, there's been absolutely no reform of that system at all. I think that if you I mean, sometimes I give talks and I show photographs of Beveridge's prototype of his employment office. It looks exactly the same as a job centre. And basically what you receive in the current service is you receive advice on how to get a job. And I mean, I've written about that as well, because you have to go through all these application processes for jobs that are never advertised. And then you receive benefits. And that is exactly what Beveridge conceived in the 1930s. What's happened is that the benefits have been cut and the process has been put online. And one really great thing that's happening now, I mean, one really important thing about moving the 1945 settlement forward was that people in the war experienced each other's lives. And you can see on social media that people, middle-class people who read The Guardian, are now having to kind of apply for universal credit, and they're realizing, you know, they sympathize with it intellectually, but now, like, it's your life. Are you really meant to live on that? Are you really meant to go through that system? I think that's really important. So what I would say is that what we've had from the right is a marketization of a 1930s system. We haven't had reform. And what we need now is really profound reform, which first of all separates the financial entitlements out of everything else. I mean, that should just come, there should be, and we could debate whether that's in the form of a transition income or a basic income, whatever, but obviously there should be at a different level an income. We're going to need that in the modern economy to keep retraining and so on. And then there should be kind of thought about what form of support you need. And actually, I mean, one of my kind of deeper critiques of the welfare state is that what we can see very powerfully is what you need to find work, and most importantly progress in work, which is the hardest bit, is a diverse network of relationships. And of course, the more you need those, the less likely you are to have them. So what you need is an approach that connects people together in new ways, and that can't happen through any kind of benefit office or universal credit.
Okay, so the next question coming from Susan Hanson. It's quite a short one. Susan, can you hear us?
Hello, hi. What is your opinion about universal basic income? You mentioned it, but I would have thought that was the absolute key to the new society, because we don't have to work anymore. That with mechanisation, artificial intelligence, there's enough systems to make us able to survive, and work becomes what we can do on top. Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, I'm nervous to tread into the universal basic income territory with Compass. I'm on a journey. I really am not a supporter of universal basic income, or have not been, and that's for two reasons. One is because the financial analysis and all the modelling I've read results with a kind of conclusion that the level of income that any public would support is so low that in fact it would be a kind of, you know, a sort of universal credit income of some kind. It wouldn't really be a universal income. And the other reason that I'm very nervous about it is because, I mean, since Radical Help has been translated, and a lot of my kind of work has been in Scandinavia, where they've adopted the models. And in the beginning, of course, I couldn't believe that I was going to be invited to kind of go and work in Scandinavia, which has the systems that we all look up to. But in fact, there's a huge concern in Scandinavian countries that the welfare state takes very good care of people, but doesn't help them in any way to transform their lives. And that also because it takes care of people to a certain level, there's actually very little national engagement with those deeper questions. There's this idea that, oh, well, people have got an income, people have got good services, why should we engage any further in this? Whereas really, transforming society means everybody into the debate, not just hoping that because we've kind of, you know, this person's got an income, they should be all right. And I think that we can see that sort of the forms of poverty and exclusion are so complex and so beyond, I mean, they are relational, they're so beyond just having an income, that I've got grave doubts that giving people a low income is going to begin to structurally challenge in the way we need to, and at the same time is going to kind of feed a sort of dialogue of, well, you know, those people should stand on their own feet because they've got an income now. However, I'm doing work on the future of work at the moment, and one thing that has, most people I know disagree with me, and this is a kind of live debate I have almost every day, but one of the things that I think I find very interesting is the idea of, could we invent a transition income? Because if we're going to kind of have a Green New Deal, we are going to have to ask people to transition from their work. One of the categories, I've got 4 categories of people in work that I'm working with in my new research, and one of them are people in high value manufacturing jobs that are, if you like, dirty. So immediately before the lockdown, I was working with people making nuclear weapons. Now, these are very well paid jobs for people who leave school and train as apprentices. So we can't realistically ask people to give up those jobs unless they've got the chance of an equal income whilst they transition into something else. And at the same time, because we're going to go through kind of 8-20 sort of different forms of work, we're going to need an income that supports us to have high value retraining and learning, because we know at the moment that's available to very few people, and particularly not available to women who never, because they've also got the kind of household duties, are able to access that. So I think thinking of a transition income would be really interesting. And actually I would like to ask Rishi Sunak to do that right now. I'd like him to offer every British Airways air hostess, and, you know, as a kind of classic dirty industry, a great transition income to see if they'd like to kind of work in the care industry, where they have got brilliant skills that could be used. So thinking about that, I mean, you've asked such a good question and such a deep question, but the other thing that we haven't got time to go into is that I don't actually agree that people don't need to work. I think that still our identity, our purpose, our social connections are deeply implicated in our work. And so in fact, the work I'm doing is actually rethinking what a good working life looks like for everybody, rather than thinking we don't need work.
Yeah, it's a huge, we could probably spend an hour talking.
I know, sorry, it sounds so bad. There's so much I could say.
No, so there are two questions which are kind of on a similar thing. So I thought we could have two in a row.
Yeah.
So Sue S and then Susan. So you had a question about the NHS and care?
It seems so completely stupid. I mean, this before the coronavirus stuff, to have care for the elderly completely separate from the National Health Service and funded in a completely different and even more inadequate way. So I was interested that you said you didn't think the idea of a national care service was appropriate to the 21st century. And I was just wondering why. Because, I mean, I absolutely accept what you're saying about how things have changed and people have been helping their neighbours so much more during this current crisis. But equally, the National Health Service has become much more sort of locally organised and locally managed, with very variable results from when it was originally envisaged. And caring for elderly and people with disabilities is very expensive, and local authorities, local groups aren't going to manage it without central support. You know, I just want to know what you think, really.
Okay, well, let me talk about care first of all. So I definitely think we need a national system of support for care. It's just that I think that the NHS is a factory system. You know, it's built to replicate the factory. So it's command and control, it's extremely hierarchical. Nurses can do one thing, doctors another, managers another, decisions move very slowly up and down chains. You know, you yourself are given a number, you're placed in a bed, your discrete body part is fixed as you move along the conveyor belt, and so on. So the pattern of design was absolutely beautiful and perfect in the 1950s, very modern and brilliantly designed to treat infectious disease. The challenge now is that it overlaps with care, that most of us don't suffer from infectious diseases. We suffer from one or more, increasingly numbers more as we go older, like me, of chronic conditions that need, you know, that are in fact hospitalized because there's nowhere else to go, but need very different forms of support. So I think what we need is an intersecting care service. But what I was trying to say is that I think that there's been this idea that, oh, why can't it be like the National Health Service? We so love our National Health Service. In our minds, we've got this idea that we're going to replicate it and call it care. Whereas what I think is that we need something that is highly national, in the sense that wherever you are, you'll be taken care of, but highly distributed, deeply human and relational, which means it needs to be local in a different way. So it doesn't look or feel like a 1950s health service. I think, of course, it needs national funding, and it needs, you know, kind of a tax base to do that, which links to the kind of earlier points I was making about how we kind of rethink the economic side. But I think also it needs to be able to blend different forms of resource, which we're very frightened of, because rightly we always fear that'll just mean it'll be letting the kind of state off the hook. But we know that good care is about blending, you know, time with relationships, with state money in different ways. one of my experiences, the first experiment actually I started with Participle, that's in Radical Health, is actually the last chapter in the book, but the first experiment was building with communities a prototype of this national care service, which is still running actually in some communities, and we took to 10 different places. And I've thought in sort of recent days how incredible it would have been if that was still running, because I mean, one just a sort of practical thing is that one of the big challenges that care homes are facing now is they're having to receive patients that are infected with COVID, because the hospitals can't care for them after a certain point, and then of course they're going into kind of houses where other vulnerable people are living. But we had kind of a highly relational, part voluntary, part funded system in every local area of supporting people in their homes and in kind of small groups, and it would have been very powerful to be able to use that kind of social infrastructure now. So I think we can call it a national care service. It definitely needs to be national, but just its characteristics need to be very different from the post-war health service, whose characteristics I believe should also change. But you know, let's start with building the new. That's much easier as the 45-degree change, you know, as you know, build the alternative model first.
All right. Okay, I think in the interest of time, we should probably move on. So Matt, you had a question. Do you want to ask it?
Hi, thanks. Hilary, I run something called Local Trust, which is a slightly brave experiment in putting £1 million out in the hands of communities in each of 150 largely left behind and peripheral estates around the country, and supporting them to make what they can of it to build their own social structures and solutions. I guess 7 years into the experiment, what we've found is that those communities where the starting point is there aren't the places to meet, civic organisation is quite low, and there's low levels of connectivity, just take a huge effort to shift. You're talking about getting from a place of very little to a point where people are starting to explore what they can do themselves, being maybe a 7-year or a 10-year journey. And I'm wondering how you start to sell that as a priority at a time when politics tends to look for rhetorically driven quick fixes and, you know, electoral cycle dependent or related solutions. So a lot of what you're advocating, and we have a couple of copies of your book on our shelves in our abandoned office, but a lot of this feels like a generational task.
Well, it's such a good question. Of course, you're right. It is generational. And it is also true that radical help is not a kind of modern political recipe and the sort of like, here are 3 things, do them and the world will be fixed. And your question also goes back to the idea of the fact we would have had a welfare state, whether the left or the right implemented it. It would have looked slightly different, but the fact is that there was that consensus, which meant there could be that kind of long-term planning and investment, which is what we need now. I mean, from my own work, what I found is that it is possible to work on a sort of 10-year horizon whilst quite quickly creating small-scale change that people can touch and feel within a community that kind of then generates further energy. And I also think that many places that don't have that infrastructure, I mean, of course, this is difficult because I really want to ask you more questions about your question, because I think there's so much of this infrastructure. I'm not saying it's everywhere. Of course, you know, kind of I work on estates where perhaps there isn't some, or a village or whatever, but generally the picture is much more flourishing, I think, than we think is there. And most people have got something adjacent to them that they could build off. But the problem at the moment is it's quite hard to build that adjacency, because if you're in a community with something, it's quite fragile and you need the resources for yourself to sustain yourself. So the idea of moving kind of to the next community and supporting them when you're kind of trying to grow your own thing is quite difficult. And resource doesn't move in that way at the moment. But if it did, I think we would have change really quite fast. And we'll look up afterwards what you do. Can we put a link to Matt's organisation on because it sounds so interesting and so much kind of the way that I think we need to work, which is, you know, put resource collectively in the hands of communities, and then, you know, put in support to, whether it's through Poverty Truth Commission or perhaps like an organisation like yours, to begin to build that infrastructure. But yes, we can't expect it to happen tomorrow. And we can't expect it to happen in isolation, as I said before, I think of kind of broader economic change. You know, I've been working in East Ayrshire recently, where there's just extraordinary, through a very radical local authority, really strong community infrastructure growing. But, you know, I've been working in communities where there is no broadband, and going to see a doctor is a bus journey on a bus that goes twice a day and costs, you know, more than a London tube ticket for a return fare. And, you know, this is a situation that has grown and been sustained over governments of every colour, but make any form of development impossible. So I think we've got to begin to kind of, these things are a bit boring, but we've got to begin to grapple with that, because otherwise the rest can't take root.
See, I mean, I think there are, I mean, every place is different, and I guess two places I was recently before the lockdown, one of them was identified in The Guardian as one of the most depressed places in Britain, but has thrived in the face of the COVID challenge and has come together and really done some amazing things. But then asked by the local authority to help their neighbouring estate, they felt that they weren't able to, because actually what they were able to do was support themselves but not look further. And I think that, you know, that relationship-based solutions sometimes also have to accept parochiality. In terms of GPs.
Well, but I think they need to be designed not to do that, actually. So first of all, I totally agree with you, and I think it's completely, of course, I mean, on a local level, like if I can't cope taking care of my own children and my elderly relatives, how would I have time to help my neighbour? I mean, if we don't put in resource, then I think it's perfectly rational that people can't then help the next community along. Although, I mean, it was very interesting in Doncaster recently with the floods to see that the kind of hardest hit areas were the kind of more wealthy areas that were helped out by those with less, which provoked quite an interesting conversation of, would we have done that the other way round? I don't know. Oh, but you were saying something else. I want to say something.
No, it's okay. I think there's probably, I don't want to dominate Neil's conversation. First of all, I'm not a campus member, and he very kindly invited me to attend this. So thank you, Neil. But it would be interesting to follow up. We're about to publish a history of community-based responses to crisis, looking back through the plague, through the Great Famine of the 1790s, which is of course what then spurred community co-ops and the anti-mill movement, through to perhaps the Great Depression and the subsistence production associations you saw emerging in Wales. And there's a whole lot of different stories of kind of how radical association-based solutions emerged from points of crisis, some of them good, some of them less successful. And I think perhaps one of the challenges in unpicking what's going on here is looking at what we can have as ambitions for a long-term change in society that might be 5 years or 10 years off, as all of the pressures that are, you know, being accelerated drive towards that. But whether there are short-term transformatory fixes in terms of new ways of doing things that can be accelerated and encouraged to be adopted in the short term. But maybe that's a conversation to have with Steve Reed rather than over the Zoom conversation.
Well, it's a good question, and I think it's a really important one because I'm not so relaxed that we can take our time. I mean, I think we've got an opening and we've got a moment, and we need to think about how to use that moment, actually.
Jill had quite a sort of practical question.
Thinking about change on a local level, or maybe a county level, what paths might there be to changing to the sort of system of care and concern that you would like to see? I'm afraid I haven't, I've heard you speak before, but a detailed thing, but without any national structures.
Well, I think that's really interesting, and every place is different. Of course, there's a lot going on in Devon, so it would be interesting to know how that might connect, and sort of related to Matt's previous question, how some of that could be used adjacent to build something else. I mean, one thing on care in particular is that when we built this at Participle, the social enterprise that kind of the stories I tell, but we built a response called Circle, and which was sort of local social infrastructure for care. And it was quite interesting how that it was a social enterprise model with the idea that that was the only way really to kind of raise funding in order to kind of, you know, in order to kind of grow the model. But really what we could have done in the ideal world was make it like a sort of, you know, TEDx. We could have put, we know what's needed. I could have put it in a box. I could have sent it to you, which is kind of, you know, some basic software so that you can manage lots of people, you know, without kind of needing a whole team. and some kind of lessons learned and some kind of leaflets to get going. I mean, I don't mean literally, but, you know, some kind of design materials to get going to build your community, and perhaps a phone line to me or one of my colleagues, so once a week you could have checked in to see how it's going. And I think you could build something completely brilliant. And in fact, in the case of Devon, at the time, we had a group who wanted to do exactly that, but I couldn't kind of raise the money or get the format to kind of send out the box. But I think, you know, who do you know, I'd ask you, that would like to do this with you? Because that's all that's needed, 2 or 3, and off we go.
Brilliant. Okay, last one, really quickly. Wystan, are you there? You had quite a nice question to end on, I think.
My question is, to what extent do you think any of this is feasible under the government that we've got? Is there kind of potentially a synergy with the move fast and break things sort of mindset and getting away from big centralized state? Or is it more we've got our backs up against the wall for, you know, austerity part 2 after the coronavirus, and anything like this is out of the window?
And Hilary, you know, is Danny Kruger going to be the voice of future conservatism, who would be quite aligned to what you think, or is it going to be the kind of, you know, austerity, you know, nationalism kind of politics?
Yes, it's a really interesting question, and it's a kind of moment of balance, isn't it? The sort of Dominic Cummings move fast and break things makes me very nervous, because it's very unhuman, and, you know, sort of my models are very humanistic. They're thinking about us with all our kind of affects and defects and how we can build from that, and so that makes me very nervous. I think Rishi Sunak is an interesting person. He is, you know, he is there, isn't he, to go to ever greater heights with a reputation to make. So what interests me are, what are the forces that could be brought to bear that could persuade Rishi Sunak right now, with all the money he is about to kind of, his largesse, to begin to think about, sort of, as I was saying earlier in the conversation, some basic principles that could be put around it, which begin to kind of make this form of transition. Because I think that, with a sort of, let's say, Danny Kruger kind of sort of human framing, I mean, that would be a classic. I guess Danny and I would be a classic kind of Beveridge, left, right, same principles. It will look different because of our different heritage, but we would be kind of aiming in the same direction. I mean, at the moment, I think the most likely thing is that pure incompetence perhaps will bring the government down, and we will have a different moment. But that's a different kind of worry, because do we have any political alliances in waiting that would be able to do this any better? I'm not sure. I think the challenge is now how to make all the kind of very local energy felt in a way that can move the debate centrally. And I mean, before we kind of went live, Neil and I were talking about this. A lot of Zoom conversations about it, all quite tiring, but how does that translate into the action we need? I mean, I guess it would be really good, Neil, to convene a group around that conversation. Like, how do we move that? It's not clear at the moment, but it's clear it needs to happen.
So last bit from me, then we end. By the way, I'm quite attracted to the Ronnie Corbett model of doing interviews and allowing you to sit there and go off in lots of different directions.
I need a big black chair.
Yeah, and I need to be called the producer. Look, I think this is a moment for acceleration. Everyone's using the Lenin quote of there are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. And I think we're at that kind of moment. We can't have a virus determinism. But as ever with Compass, for you, where does hope come from? Why do you keep writing, talking, going out to different places? What keeps you going? And what really spurs you to think that something better, a good society is possible, Hilary?
Well, I think there are 3 things. So the first is that we're in the challenge. I mean, again, if I can just be Corbett-esque for one moment in the closing, there's a psychologist, or I don't know, some kind of psych person who's recently written a book, and I heard her interviewed on the radio, and she said that 50% of her clients are calmer because they're anxious and the world has caught up with their anxiety. And there's part of me that's like that. I mean, I think this is just a warm-up act for what's coming. So how, you know, and I mean, that's a terrible thing to say, because so many people have lost, you know, dear ones, and so many people are suffering so badly in this lockdown. But but I do think what's coming is even more frightening. So, you know, we've been given a warning, and we need to kind of think about how we're going to act now to kind of pivot and make that kind of social green transition. So that's an opportunity, I think, and that makes me hopeful. The second thing is, you know, that Rebecca Solnit talks about how in crises you sort of see the beauty beneath. You get that even when you're suffering, you know, that in Hurricane Katrina, people saw the stars for the first time. They hadn't been able to see them. And I think that we are seeing that beauty beneath. We've talked about the social infrastructure, and I think the mobilization, I mean, where I live in Peckham, we're quite connected, but just as it was beginning, I kind of called my neighbours in my street, because we all know each other, and I was like, we've got to get organised tonight. We've got to meet and get organised to support people in our kind of, you know, here. And by the time I got home, I already had a leaflet through the door that some other kind of young people in the street who I didn't know had already begun the organisation. And I think that's what we've seen everywhere, and that can only kind of give us hope without losing the kind of the sort of, you know, the practical bit, which is now how do we connect that to change.
Hilary Cottam, that was a fantastic hour. It flew by, as I told you it would do. They were really good questions. Thank you, everyone. And they were really good answers. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, everyone, for the questions and for listening, and for Grace for helping sort the questions. As ever, the support of our members is really what makes it possible for us to do these calls and all our campaigning, policy and ideas work. So if you're on the podcast and listening and you want more of this, then please do think about joining Compass, which you can do at compassonline.org.uk/podcast. You can always tweet me at Neil, NEAL_Compass, or you can get hold of Compass at Compass Office. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard on the podcast, then please give us a rating so more people can hear us, and so more people can know as well that it's bloody complicated. So thank you again, finally, Hilary.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Neil, and thank you to everybody who joined, and for, you know, it's really fantastic. Thank you.
It has been a fantastic conversation. Next week, we'll be joined by Green MP Caroline Lucas to discuss the future of the planet and how we save it, no less. I can't wait. Until then, everyone, please keep safe and keep well. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.